really, really wonderful to be here. I actually grew up in Syracuse, and so I'm really familiar with this weather and packed all sorts of layers for the inevitable unpredictability of central New York climate. And I really, really appreciate this opportunity to come here and talk to you. I always think it's always so fun for me to go around and meet people and hear about what they're doing in their communities. And what I'm going to take you through tonight is a bit of the journey of how I got to be working in transportation. I never, ever, growing up in Syracuse, thought that was something I would end up doing. And then, you know, what sort of kind of brings me and continues to carry me forward in thinking about the public benefits and the social impacts that we can have through transportation. So given that context, you might wonder what I'm doing at Uber right now, given the company's history. And I have to say, you know, I've been tracking Uber since its very beginning, and initially was very excited about the potential, and then was really quite dismayed at the company's approach to transportation and working with cities. And then I have to say, like, they did a couple of things in the last couple of years that really made me rethink what was going on, and it coincided with the work I was doing and the journey I was taking and trying to continue on the path of making change through transportation. And so, I don't know if the projector just kind of went dim, but so I just wanted to say that I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We have a new CEO. What we're trying to do with the cities program is, you know, think about serving the cities that we're in. And I just wanted to lay that out as a context so you weren't, you know, wondering what is this, you know, what is the motivation here. And I think this is very much about my story in a way, and also this, like, all of our stories. So this is a little house I grew up in. I guess it's not so little. It was little for the neighborhood. It was the smallest house my parents could buy. We were immigrants, so this was the American dream: get the house that you could get in the best school district for your kids, right? And when I was little, I was always really annoyed by the fact that, you know, I lived on this cul-de-sac. My friends lived over here, and my school was over there, and I could not leave. I could not walk here. There weren't any sidewalks, and the only exit was here. And at that exit was a Doberman that was unfenced. You know, it was like free-for-all over there in the cul-de-sac in Syracuse. And it really gave me an experience, right, of being somewhat isolated. We were immigrants. We kind of kept to ourselves. It was really hard to have social interactions, you know, and to meet people other than at school. And I really enjoyed school, but, you know, there's life outside of school. And it wasn't until I moved to a city for the first time that I experienced this, where this was kind of a public space. It was a street, but it was full of different people. They're all doing their thing. You could be walking by yourself, walking with friends, and I saw this happen over and over again. I lived in London for a while. It was a similar kind of experience. And even recently, I was working with a firm in Copenhagen quite frequently, and saw, like, you know, it's very similar things going on the street, at the street level, and thinking about public space. And it's not just like kind of nostalgic cities that are Western. This is a street in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. So you can see, like, this liveliness, people at grade, doing all sorts of different things. And then I was walking around here at Park Avenue, and I was like, oh, this is the street, right? Like, there's something really lovely about this street. And, you know, we were talking a little bit about why, but, you know, it's very narrow lanes. There's this little daylighting here. You feel really comfortable crossing the street. There's so much just to draw the eye down the sidewalk. It's not fancy, but I actually was so kind of into walking down the street, I got lost and just kept walking, forgot what I was doing. And I think so often we know that, but we design this, right? We design things like this that don't match what, we really want to experience. And as I was thinking a lot about this and, going on with my work, realizing as learning, streets are a huge part of space in cities. They're in fact, the majority of public space in the cities. So if I was coming at it from a design perspective, streets suddenly had a huge, enormous importance in how you should think about public space in a city. And streets can be like this. So that led me to working with Project for Public Spaces, where we thought a lot about community engagement and what placemaking means. And I also worked at a local advocacy organization, as a bike advocate, pedestrian advocate in New York City. Learned a lot about civic engagement, but also just not even engagement, but like civics, plain old civics. How do you change and work with local government? And one of the projects we did there was play streets. We closed a street down so kids could play, especially in neighborhoods that don't have a lot of access to playgrounds or open space, and was mounting these studies to create the evidence, to get the program into the city program. So there was this advocacy, and I worked a lot at intersection design, because I was more in the design side of things at the time. And every time we did an intersection redesign or added something great, we had a win, we would have to go back to the city and start in another place and start all over again. And so I really got interested in policy because I found that was a much more systemic way of making that change. It was pretty obvious kids should have a place to play. Why is it so hard to make that happen? And that was a constant question in my mind. How do we make this just the way that city does things? So I got into policy. I went to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I was really interested in climate change. So stood up a cities and transportation program in the energy and climate change. So I went from extraordinarily local work, where I was looking at intersection design, to global policy on climate change. And in that setting, I was realizing that in a lot of the policy conversations with people who were literally making decisions and that would affect us for many, many years to come, that they weren't thinking about people. There was very little understanding of how supply and demand and energy and et cetera were affecting people on the ground, affecting localities even, at the city level. It was, in global policy, often that was at the time considered, was subnational, not a state. It wasn't about statesmanship, and, we can't say what states should do, what states should tell their cities to do. But to me, there was a huge missed opportunity to create that network. And also space. So a lot of these energy and climate policies don't have a spatial understanding. We're talking about building efficiency. What are we really talking about? What does that really look like? What is the experience we're crafting for the people in the cities? Because if you're a city leader, you're trying to put it all together. You're not there's building efficiency here and there's transport, you're trying to bring it all together and aim for different goals. But one of the things that was really useful to me is that there's an urgency behind transportation, which is that it is one of the fastest growing sectors for carbon emissions. It's also it has the greatest warming effect. So it has more warming effect than power. And the world is urbanizing. And as we're urbanizing, we've been destroying the places we love. We've been destroying the climate in the process, and we need to do better at protecting the things we love about a city. So really, transportation as usual is unsustainable. At the same time, we're urbanizing. That means that the demand on transportation, on mobility, is going to double. It's going to double. People have that demand, and we have to drive climate emissions down by 60%. So it's a significant challenge that requires everyone to participate in. And I mentioned working from very local to global and all the way different things in between, and it's seeing an ecosystem of different things that people need to do. And it's not just climate change, so transportation has impact on so many other aspects of our lives, on health, the cost, on congestion, on preventative fatalities, right, safety, traffic deaths. And there's this new kind of thinking about how we should think about transportation, because transportation technology is a really fast-growing area now where people are talking about shared, there's data, analytics, electrification, maybe even automation into the future. And I think with all of that, we still have to think about people. We have to center people in our work, in technology, and relying on technology will only get us half part of the way there. Actually debatable how far it'll get us there, to be honest. There's a lot of questions. The studies are not great, and we have a lot of work to do. So I work for a company that, if you were following the press yesterday, we got, the Union of Concerned Scientists found that a trip in ride-hailing is 70% more carbon intensive than the trips they displace. We can talk about the methodology afterwards, but there's a lot more. We have to get a lot better at this. Centering people is really important, and transportation choices matter in carbon. So part of the reason I thought it was so important to go into policy, but also then in turn to join a place like Uber, is that the Uber was able to make a culture change in choice. It got people to think about and experience a really different kind of set of options than the way that we had. And I think there's something very powerful in that possibility. And so, the choices matter, and in health. So someone was telling me today about a YMCA that has a fitness center, and everyone's really upset about how far they have to walk from the parking garage. This is very common, but we're spending way too much money on this, and it's public money. But more than that, our lives, we're risking our lives in our health. So when people are walking and biking and taking transit, there are lower rates of obesity, and fast traffic can get in the way of being better neighbors even. So there's a social impact. Our networks are impacted by transportation. When you put people in the center, you start thinking about how they're experiencing things literally, the sensory experience. So what is the average walking speed? What would it take for someone to walk down the street? This kind of 4-second variation going down the street. What are you smelling? What are you hearing? The New York City sirens are incredibly loud because every siren has to be louder than the other sirens. What are we looking at as we're going down the street? And those things are all super important. So that experience where I said design didn't match our experience, this is the kind of things that you need to start thinking about, and you can do it through thinking about transportation. Efficient use of space has a lot to do with it. It's not vehicles, it's people. You have to move people. And people are not the starting point when speeds are really high. So we saw the social impact of high speeds where you can't create those connections across the street when there's fast moving traffic. On a street like this where it's designed for 45 mile per hour, you're not gonna get social connections either, even if you put a bike lane, if you put, you put sidewalks, it doesn't matter. This is not the kind of place that people want to walk. Technology doesn't change the fundamentals of space. So we're talking about places, we're talking about social connections, we're talking about centering people. Technology doesn't answer. It's not the silver bullet. But the thing is, technology could potentially nudge people towards a wider array of options. The idea is, though, there's going to be a lot of shiny things flying at you, I think, in the next, this is the time. The transportation technology sector is growing very rapidly. There's new vehicles being designed all the time, but the point is to move more people with efficient use of space. It's people, it's not the vehicle. So where do people want to go and move people? You can do that also with pickup drop-off. So this is something that, I don't know if you were following the press, there's been some transit priority streets in New York City on 14th Street, in San Francisco on Market Street. So one of the ways that technology can help is to nudge people to get off, not pick up a car on Market Street, but to go off onto a side street. Prioritize people, cyclists, scooters, giving them space on the road, giving them protected, comfortable space. Maybe there are even slow lanes where We're talking about, we're not sure what that next vehicle will be exactly. If it is a scooter, I just saw a scooter with a seat and think that they'll soon go back to bicycles. But, thinking about, the slower speeds, 15 miles per hour, giving them plenty of space, nudging people towards those decisions. Because all of these different modes meet a lot of different needs. And if you're thinking about the city in its entirety, you should be thinking about all the different experiences. I think even riding a bicycle, if you take your bike out with you during the day, you have to kind of bring your bike around all day long. Every leg, you're kind of going around with your bike. And I noticed at my office, I can't leave my bike in the garage overnight. So if I happen to feel tired and I wanted to just, take the bus home, I actually couldn't do that. I would be forced to take my bike. And that's something I think we should start thinking is what is that trip chaining? What do people really need to get done in the course of a day? Are we making it easy for them to do that? What sort of distances do they have to traverse and when? Designed to protect the most vulnerable users. So, have very high speeds, have a exponentially greater impact in terms of the risk of a fatality. Also think about the different people who are on the street. So people of color are disproportionately impacted by fatalities. I think there's a reason why, if you think about, systemically where investments are made in designing streets. So it's not super surprising, but it's not designed for now. This is equity versus equality. It's not that everyone gets the same thing. It's that everyone is lifted to the same level, to the same opportunity. And a couple other principles I wanted to walk you through as I thought about, what is that sustainable future that we want to build. Think about every trip starts with a walk. No matter where you start, you're walking out of your house and it starts, right? Like car, bus, train, bike, or scooter, we have to balance that as we think about the design of our neighborhoods. I actually made this presentation, this slide before I moved to San Francisco. I moved to San Francisco recently from New York. I never thought I would leave New York, but here we are. And I used this slide and I ended up living near this transit station. So I just realized that today as I was reviewing the slides. And I think it's really interesting that somehow that happened. That was my illustrative slide of the walk. And you also have to think about connecting walking paths. So the connectivity is super important. I bet this happens a lot. It happens a lot in Syracuse, this thing on the left. Whoop. Where the sidewalk just kind of ends, and or you have a light pole in the middle of the sidewalk. That happens in Syracuse a lot. It's just thinking about if you're someone who needs to get somewhere, how easy are you making it for that person? It doesn't have to be expensive. It's just comfortable. It's not fancy. And then there's a few more kind of technical things that help really a city manage the entire system. So you can use pricing schemes. In London, they have congestion pricing. It's now moving into an ultra low emission zone, and it's incentivizing people to use higher efficiency vehicles. You can do parking pricing. You can think about pricing the curb. There are ways of incentivizing behavior. Don't forget about land use to tie it all together, right? So just because you have roads doesn't mean it's easy to get to places. And as you probably saw from my cul-de-sac picture, this was exactly the problem I faced as a kid, where this was impossible, and there weren't sidewalks anyway. But think about how to make that trip the most efficient as possible. Intersection density, so that what this is describing has the greatest impact on walking. So being able to make those connections. Maria showed me a mall downtown that was I think torn down, and then parcels were remade, and that was something that was really interesting to see. That's literally what this is speaking to, is that creating that more of a grid and more of an opportunity for those intersections to have more of them, so people aren't walking around mega blocks. Don't waste money on parking. I heard that you guys already have parking maximums downtown. That's super exciting. It's been something, it's like a trend across the country that localities are trying to make happen. Very recent development in California. But this is literally what developers are, have to build if there's a parking minimum. And they could use it on more units, retail space, amenities, open space, adjacent to the development. There's lots of different ways of using this money. Parking is where land use and transportation come together a lot, not just within developments, as I was showing here, but at the curb. That curb line is where that happens. And free, excessive, or underpriced on-street parking will induce driving. So if people can park, they will drive, generally, if they have a car already. And what you're seeing as I'm going through these ideas is there's a lot more enticement to maybe not get that second car, to maybe leave your car at home because you have a guarantee way home somehow. That sounds like the transit agency is doing a lot with on-demand, trying out on-demand services. So there's bike share, so there's all these different options. And so it gives you, parking is like the last frontier, I would say. And then what I wanted to do is sort of the last chapter of this talk was kind of take you through a case study of like, what do you do? Like, this is a lot of information, right? Like these are a lot of ideas to pull together. Where do you start? How do you do this? It was something I thought a lot about when I was at a national philanthropy called TransitCenter. We were asked, and so we were trying to figure out who to fund. Where should we put our resources to get the people on the ground to be more supportive of public transit? And a foundation asked us to think about, just in general, what are the human factors behind transportation innovation? The bike lanes in New York City, who did that? How did that happen? Who made it happen? What were the things that they had to do to make that happen? It's not just getting the manual together. What did it take to get the manual in the first place? The manual didn't exist for a long time, right? It was very recent. So I just want to walk you through this study. This is a result of the study where, it's an ecosystem. The civic organizations like the Design Center and others, Reconnect Rochester, so many in Rochester, they're incredibly important to get those ideas going. But then you need city leadership, and you need leaders to step up and be able to empower people to make it happen. And there's lots of different ways of doing it. And then you need those people within the agencies to feel empowered and to run with it. And this creates a cycle of making that change possible, and more innovation then becomes possible because you're offering proof points constantly to the public. You're demonstrating the positive outcomes constantly. So, it's very, very difficult to pull everyone together. This is just one little snapshot. You're thinking about a ton of different ideas, lots of different departments. So very first is maybe set a vision, figure out what it is exactly you want to target, maybe measure, try to figure out like what is the thing that will measure the progress. When I was at Transportation Alternatives, and I think Mike Bloomberg put this out, and it was really interesting because it was the first kind of inventory of carbon emissions for the city, and it was meant as a strategic plan for the city to 2030. What it compelled was interagency cooperation. So suddenly there were metrics in there that said, this is our goal. We have a certain carbon reduction target, and every agency, these are the strategies you can do. And then this is the benchmark we want you to hit across the board. And it was clear when you looked at that table that you couldn't do it by yourself as one agency. You needed to partner with other agencies to get it done, and you probably needed to partner with those civic organizations and others to get it done. So if you're, one agency is parks, or the health department, you're trying to get people to be more active, getting kids into schoolyards, right? That's going to require Department of Ed, maybe parks, a whole bunch of different agencies to make that happen. And what's interesting about a plan like this too is I snuck in a little kind of snapshot of the civic groups that also informed the plan. So the civic groups, knowing that this plan was in the works, formed a campaign and fed ideas into that process. So this idea of closing down Broadway was a result of these groups coming in and knowing that this process would have targets and trying to give the city ideas for how to achieve it. And so you first take small steps. So that was a huge vision. Take small steps. Show how it's possible. Pilot projects. What are the temporary interventions? What are the pilot projects that can then build up to larger strategies? This is the very first public plaza that was made in New York City. It replaced 15 cars, and the DOT literally came in overnight, put out the construction barrels, and painted it, and then put out the planters. And that was it. And they worked with the Business Improvement District. So there was a partner who had informed all the businesses, like, don't worry, I found another spot. Parking is distributed throughout the neighborhood, but we're going to create this lovely space in the neighborhood that doesn't really have a lot of green space. So take small steps to get that confidence going. Then use data to build your case. So this is Times Square. Times Square was one of those places that everyone said could not be fixed. It was impossible to be fixed. I met with the Times Square planning director before Plan YC came out, and I literally remember sitting next to her and her saying, like, we can't move the curb, the DOT won't let us move the curb. So they did this data collection exercise to show how disproportionate Times Square was in terms of people versus car space. That there was 89% of road space, 11% people space, but the use was actually the opposite. There were 90%, the traffic was 90% pedestrians and 10% vehicles. And that's how they started to build that case. So this was Times Square before. Same tactic, larger scale, right? So you start with your pilot, larger scale, put out the lawn chairs. They bought out the inventory at Costco. I wish I found the newspaper, but there's a newspaper article that said, like, the DOT thinks that lawn chairs are going to work. Every lawn chair, there was a butt in every lawn chair the next morning. It was really beautiful. And more permanent seating. Lawn chairs don't last forever, especially if there's millions of people going through your space. More permanent seating, and a final redesign. This is a real photo of the space, right? So this took a long time, but that initial experience was created by those pilot projects. And there was some and you keep measuring, you keep showing how you're improving, and show, like, people who say that traffic times won't improve or what have you. You just keep on measuring and showing how it does or does not. If it's a pilot, and it's truly a pilot, it doesn't work. But in this case, it did. So this has been going around the country. This is in Portland. This was a highway that was torn down to create a waterfront park. And it's happening around the world. This was a highway torn down in Seoul. It can happen in Rochester. Thank you.